Terry Teachout. Okay, we're going to turn that off and this one on. Thank you, Crosby. You make me blush. And I want you all to know that if you don't like this lecture, it's his fault. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here to begin with. It's an honor for me to be asked back for the second time to appear on this extraordinary lecture series. And of course, I am always happy to be back in Kansas City. There are many familiar faces in this audience, and some that will be more familiar later this evening. I suspect that it's even more of a pleasure for me to be here than you can easily imagine, because a biographer spends the better part of his life sitting all alone in a room, pecking away at a keyboard for years on end. So it's always a treat for him to get up in front of a live audience and share some of the fruits of his protracted labors. And rarely is the biographer's task more challenging or more exciting than when he spends those long years telling the story of a great man who was determined to keep his story from being told. Duke Ellington may have lived his life in public, but he did everything in his power to keep it private. He talked not to explain himself, but to conceal himself. And he almost never told anyone, even those who supposed themselves to be his friends, what he really thought about anything. Yet he talked so fluently and impressively that nearly everyone believed him, save for those who had reason to know better. He made up stories about his life and music out of whole cloth, especially when it came to the subject of his love life. Throughout his life, Ellington was catnip to women, and he rarely said no when they invited him into their beds. But throughout his lifetime, he lied to reporters with a perfectly straight face about his romantic relationships, and even those who knew the real story chose not to print it. They hardly ever mentioned the crescent-shaped scar on his left cheek, for example, which you can see on the front cover of my book. And they never said that he got it when his wife attacked him with a razor after finding out that he was sleeping with an actress. Nor did they have much to say about the fact, well known to his colleagues, but completely unknown to the public at large, that many of Ellington's best-known songs were spun out of melodic fragments that he lifted from the playing of the musicians in his band. And why do such things matter? Why should we care about them? Because Duke Ellington was the most important jazz composer of the 20th century and one of the greatest composers in any genre of music. Now, there have been other important jazz composers, but Ellington was the first one of indisputable, international, culture-changing significance. Not only was he a major composer of purely instrumental music, but he also wrote some of the century's most successful popular songs, including Mood Indigo and Sophisticated Lady, many of which continue to this day to be performed and recorded. No jazz musician has left a deeper mark on world culture, and that is the reason why he deserves to have his story told in full. It's the job of a biographer to tell the truth about his subject, and that job becomes all the more important when his subject is, like Ellington, a very great man. Duke, my Ellington biography, is not a sensationalistic expose, but it is, insofar as I can make it so, an honest book, honest in every way about matters that Ellington himself never cared to discuss and never wanted anybody else to discuss. And I believe deeply that such unswerving honesty is the highest possible tribute that can be paid to Ellington's greatness. The epigraph of Duke is something that was said by Somerset Maugham, a famous writer who was also strongly inclined to keep his private life private. He wrote, "There is one very good thing to be said of posterity, and this is that it turns a blind eye on the defects of greatness." Duke Ellington was a great man and a man full of flaws. It's impossible to understand how he became what he became without understanding those flaws. I believe that my long experience as a biographer has equipped me to peel away the endless layers of deception and evasion with which Ellington covered up his secrets. At the same time, my parallel life as a working musician has equipped me to explain the secrets of the endlessly beautiful music that is the one and only reason why we still care about Duke Ellington today. Nowadays, of course, most folks know me as a drama critic, but as some folks in this room have particular reason to know, I'm also a trained musician with extensive performing experience. I was a professional jazz musician, a bass player, before becoming a full-time writer. That experience has helped me to understand Ellington's music and the world in which he lived and worked from the inside out. In Duke, I've tried to translate all this knowledge into plain English and weave it into the incredible story of Ellington's life. If you don't understand the one, you won't understand the other. Now, what makes Ellington's music sound so powerfully, unmistakably individual? To begin with, he was the first jazz composer to write music that used the still new medium of the big band with the same coloristic imagination brought by classical composers to their symphonic works. Andre Previn, one of his best-known admirers, said this: "You know, Stan Kenton can stand in front of 1,000 fiddles and 1,000 brass and make a dramatic gesture, and every studio arranger can nod his head and say, 'Oh yes, that's done like this.' But Duke merely lifts his finger, 3 horns make a sound, and I don't know what it is." Nor were Ellington's innovations limited to the field of orchestration. What set him apart was not his virtuoso command of instrumental color, but how he used it. Mere arrangers took pop songs and dressed them up in new colors and harmonies. But Ellington, though he recorded his share of engagingly catchy hits, was better known and more widely esteemed for the pieces in which he used the language of jazz to say things that it had never said before. Previn compared him to Stravinsky and Prokofiev, Percy Grainger to Bach and Delius, Ralph Ellison to Ernest Hemingway. Within the tight confines of a single 78 sign, he spun tone parallels, a phrase that he coined, to every imaginable human emotion. He and the 900 musicians who passed through his band sang of joy and loneliness, passion and despair, faith and hope. Like Ravel and Renoir before him, Ellington was an impressionist, an artist who dealt not in ideas but images. And the life that he portrayed in sound, clearly related though it was to the world around him, was his inner life. As Cézanne put it, his goal was not to paint the subject, but to realize sensations. He looked, listened, and felt, then transformed his feelings into music. Right from the start, his music had a near pictorial quality that bore little resemblance to the extroverted dance tunes that most other jazz men were playing in the Roaring Twenties. His compositions included musical portraits of pretty women, tap dancing comedians, express trains, Shakespearean characters, and the unsung heroes of his long despised race. And he made it sound as if writing them were easy. He said, "I just watch people and observe life, and then I write about them." Of course, it wasn't that easy or that simple. Ellington's miraculously concise musical cameos had an architectural wholeness that is all but unique among early jazz compositions. A disciplined lyric miniaturist, he could express the grandest of emotions on the smallest of scales, and he knew how to fuse written ensembles and improvised solos into fully integrated musical structures. Yet he tossed his pieces off with seeming casualness. Sometimes he worked on his players in much the same way that a choreographer might make a ballet on his dancers, passing out or dictating scraps of music and then shaping and reshaping them on the spot into a piece that would only later be reduced to written form. Only a genius could have worked in so haphazard a way, but Ellington filled the bill. Genius is a big word, the right word, I think, but you should never toss around a word like that unless you're ready to put it to the test. The way to do so, needless to say, is to listen to Duke Ellington's music, the public Ellington, if you will. Naturally, I have plenty to say about him in my book, but in Duke, I also take you backstage to meet the private Ellington. Like Louis Armstrong, the subject of my previous book, Duke Ellington left behind a vast body of private papers, manuscripts, and unpublished interviews, not to mention the voluminous record of his life as a public figure. He spent much of his life talking into microphones, and though it wasn't his custom to tell the unvarnished truth to anybody, he never in his life gave an interview in which he didn't have something interesting to say. And here is an example. We are going to watch a very rare film clip, so rare that I'm not supposed to have this copy of it. So you won't tell where it came from, will you? Observe. You'll know what it is as soon as it starts to play. We won't talk to CBS about this.
Edward Kennedy Ellington is one of America's top-flight musicians. He was born in Washington, D.C. 57 years ago. Duke Ellington spent some of his teenage years, all of his adult time, composing music and leading a band around this country and abroad. Duke started with a six-piece band during World War I. In time, his band became one of the most exciting in the business. And in his 2,000 pieces of music, the critics found a style that contains the succinctness of concert music and the excitement of jazz. Duke Ellington is still working, almost always on the road, shuttling from city to city, from hotel to hotel. But he keeps his home ties here, on the top floor of this New York apartment building. That's the second one from the right, overlooking the Hudson River, with his sister, Mrs. Ruth Jane. Evening, Duke. How are you?
Hi, Ed. How are you?
Fine.
Good.
That's a very familiar scene. Duke Ellington at his piano.
Yeah, nothing happening with it, though.
Well, you look a little lonely without your band.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, the band is in Philadelphia playing right now. They're playing over there for the Potentate's Ball, Pyramid Lodge of the Shriners, you know, the temple.
Uh-huh.
And I'm going to chase right over there real madly as soon as I visit with you.
Well, Duke, is that the piano you've used to compose your thousands of tunes?
Oh, yeah, this is the piano from the old homestead where my mother and father and the whole family were, and a lot of exciting things have come out of here. Some of my most satisfying works.
Duke, can you remember when you first became really conscious of music?
Oh, yes, very well. My mother used to buy sheet music and play it on the piano, and I always remember her playing Meditation. It used to make me cry.
Uh-huh.
That's a picture of my mother over there on that wall. This is taken after she moved to New York. And, that must have been, well, I imagine she was almost 50 when this was taken.
Uh-huh.
And over here is a picture of my father. He, of course, that's a very early picture of him, but they're both our favorites. This was taken when he was about 18 or 20.
Uh-huh.
James, he played piano too, but by ear, and had a tremendous sense of humor.
Duke, at what age did you start composing?
Oh, I would say when I first started playing the piano, which was at 14.
14 or 15?
Yeah.
What was the first thing you composed?
A thing called the Soda Fountain Rag.
Soda Fountain Rag. How did it go?
Well, listen, I can't play that. It's too difficult.
Duke, those trophies behind you there, are those some of the Ellington honors?
Oh, yes, these are some of the honors, the Hall of Fame, some other downbeat plaques, Esquire trophies, my Alpha Phi Alpha, the Kappa Gamma Psi, the Key to Various City, the Page One Awards, and, got a lot of things here.
Well, Duke Ellington, as we both know, bands come and go. How do you account for the fact that yours has been up there for so long, that it's constantly in demand for, more than 30 years now, isn't it?
Well, it'll be 30 years the 4th of December, 1957. And, we just like it, and we just stay in it. That's it.
Have you changed your style very much?
Well, we sort of parallel what's happening in the United States at the time, you know. That's the way it is with jazz, I think. when, well, let's see, when Dixieland came along, that's when the, you know, the sort of leftover from the pioneer things, the rather rugged things, and then it moved up, and when Bop got here, it paralleled the tempo of all of the war things, you know, and the modern improvements.
Well, of course, staying up there means a lot more than just hard work, doesn't it?
Oh, it's about 80% luck. Good luck, that is. My idea of good luck is being at the right place at the right time, doing the right thing before the right people.
And if you have all of those combinations, then you're there. Is that right?
It's good luck, yeah.
Well, Duke,
Duke Ellington and Edward R. Murrow on Person to Person in 1957. That's one of the many primary source documents that was woven into my book. I did my best to weave them all into a piece of biographical storytelling that I hope has the narrative force and sweep of a good novel, but one that also shines the brightest possible light on Ellington's artistic achievements. So I'd like, if I may, to read you part of the prologue of Duke, a section in which I attempt to convey some sense of what he was like as a person and why it matters. So now here is an excerpt from Duke, A Life of Duke Ellington. He was the most chronic of procrastinators, a man who never did today what he could put off until next month or next year. He left letters unanswered, contracts unsigned, watches unworn, and longtime companions unwed. And the only thing harder than getting him out of bed in the afternoon was getting him to finish writing a new piece of music in time for the premiere. He liked to say, "I don't need time. What I need is a deadline." Nothing but an immovable deadline could spur Duke Ellington to decisive action. Excuse me. Though once he set to work in earnest, it was with a speed and self-assurance that amazed all who beheld it. At the end of his life, he left behind some 1,700-odd compositions, a number that is, excuse me, a number that is hard to square with the memories of his collaborators, who rarely failed at one time or another to be frustrated by his dilatory ways. That was fine with him. He knew what he needed in order to create, and as far as he was concerned, nothing and no one else mattered. He told Louis Armstrong, "As long as something is unfinished, there's always that little feeling of insecurity. And a feeling of insecurity is absolutely necessary, unless you're so rich that it doesn't matter." Though he carried himself like a prince of the realm, he was the son of a butler and the grandson of a slave. Washington, D.C., where Edward Kennedy Ellington was born in 1899, was one of America's most segregated cities, but it also had a black middle class that was proud and self-aware. Ellington's parents belonged to it, and their only son, a high school dropout whose regal demeanor belied his poor grades and seeming lack of interest in music, went out of his way to acquire its manners. For all his polish, it was his artistry, not his personality, that was the source of his enduring appeal. But it was the personality that made white people who might not otherwise have done so give him a second glance. And in time, it opened doors of opportunity through which few other blacks had been allowed to pass. Ellington's surface qualities were exploited to the hilt by Irving Mills, his white manager. Mills told an interviewer, "We wanted Duke to be recognized as someone more important." By this he meant that the best way to position his client in a market full of talented black band leaders was to present him to the world as a different kind of black man, fine-spoken and expensively tailored, a fellow whom broad-minded white folks could imagine introducing to their friends, even if they might not care to bring him home to meet their wives. Ellington himself was happy to play the game, for he saw his public image as a contribution to the welfare of his people. He said, "Every time you walk out on the street and you're exposed to a white citizen, you're acting in behalf of the race." That was why he never let his guard down. He knew that there would always be somebody looking. Over time, Mills's strategy paid off beyond either man's wildest dreams. Long before Ellington died in 1974, he had become, after Louis Armstrong, jazz's biggest celebrity, as well as the first jazz musician to be widely hailed as an artist of consequence, and not just by his fellow jazzmen, but also by such distinguished classical musicians as Aaron Copland and Percy Grainger. Their praise gave his work a cultural legitimacy at which no posterity-conscious black artist would have been inclined to turn up his nose. Yet Ellington was, like Armstrong, a popular entertainer whose music was meant to please a mass audience. Long before the swing era, his band was seen in films and heard on network radio. And long after most of the other band leaders who followed him into the limelight faded into obscurity, Ellington continued to perform on network TV and girdle the globe, playing the hits that had made him famous, if never quite rich. 12,000 people came to his funeral at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York City, his adopted hometown and the place that he loved best. By then, his baggy eyes and sardonic flattery were almost as familiar to the mourners as his music. Underneath his soigné exterior, Ellington was a self-centered hedonist who lived a nomadic existence in which everything was subordinated to his art and, insofar as possible, his pleasure. He sought to exert the maximum possible amount of control over everyone in his life by stealth. He once told Mercer Ellington, his son, "What you need to do is wake up after 2 o'clock, make phone calls, but don't move an inch. Just lie flat on your back and phone and tell everybody everything that has to be done and lay out all your plans without going anywhere. And when you come downstairs, you'll have prepared your day and you'll be the greatest." After he died, Mercer found a handwritten note among his father's papers in which Ellington summed himself up in 3 lapidary sentences. "No problem. I'm easy to please. I just want to have everybody in the palm of my hand." His selfishness was unswerving, though it did not exclude benevolence, if only on his own terms. Rex Stewart, a longtime member of his band, wrote, "Ellington is the most complex and paradoxical individual that I've ever known, a combination of Sir Galahad, Scrooge, Don Quixote, and God knows what other saints and sinners were apt to pop out of his ever-changing personality." He was at once deeply, if superstitiously, religious, and a tireless philanderer who, in the words of an admiring friend, had the sexual appetite of a romping, stomping alley cat. He was careful to keep his love life out of the papers, just as he tried never to show his vulnerability to anyone who might take advantage of it. But vulnerable he was and would always be. While he believed that his music was, to use the phrase with which he described his favorite artists, beyond category, he was painfully conscious of the racial slights that beset him throughout his life, even after he became a star. He was enraged when he learned that he had been passed over for a Pulitzer Prize in 1965. Nat Hentoff said, "That night I saw him, he was furious. He was so angry. He said, 'That's another example of what it's like to be black. They think European music, classical music, is the only criterion for art.'" It says much about Ellington that though he knew better, or should have, than to take to heart the opinion of a board of musically illiterate newspapermen, he still longed for a Pulitzer, the ultimate token of establishment approval, and was devastated when he failed to get it. None of it showed. The rage, the humiliation, the unbridled sensuality, all were kept far from prying eyes. His fans saw only what he wished them to see and nothing more. So did his colleagues. Miles Davis said, "I think all the musicians should get together one certain day and get down on their knees and thank Duke." Yet to Ellington's own musicians, he was a riddle without an answer, an unknowable man who hid behind a high wall of ornate utterances and flowery compliments that grew higher as he grew older. And while most of his sidemen admired his artistry without reservation, many of them also believed him to be unscrupulous and manipulative. On occasion, one of them would chafe at his high-handedness and give notice. Even Johnny Hodges and Billy Strayhorn, the band's two seemingly indispensable members, lost patience with him in the 50s and chose to wander for a time in the wilderness. But the wanderers, Hodges and Strayhorn included, usually returned to the fold sooner or later, knowing that the sensitive settings that he created for his players made them sound better than they could ever have dreamed of sounding on their own. They were stuck with him, and he with them, no matter how badly they behaved, and a few of them behaved badly enough to land in jail. In 1944, a journalist dubbed Ellington the hot Bach, a comparison that is likely to have vexed him. A decade earlier, he had claimed that you can't stay in the European Conservatory and play the Negro music. He insisted that his own achievement was unique unto itself, so much so that he refused to call his music jazz. He said, "I don't write jazz, I write Negro folk music." Well, he was wrong. His music is one of the cornerstones of jazz, but he was right about the singularity of that music, just as he himself was as singular as a human being can be, an improbably gaudy bird of paradise who spoke at least one undeniable truth in the self-interview that ends his autobiography, in which he wrote, question, can you keep from writing music? Do you write in spite of yourself? Answer, I don't know how strong the chains, cells, and bars are. I've never tried to escape. So that's how my book starts. And now, if you don't mind, just a few words of epilogue. I spent, I think, about 5 years working on Duke, roughly the same amount of time that I spent writing my last book, Pops, The Life of Louis Armstrong. In the past few months, a lot of people have been asking me an interesting question. Of the two men, which one do you like more? Well, on one level, the answer is obvious. Satchmo was clearly the more likable man, in part because his personality was so completely open and unguarded. Ellington, however, was far more intriguing for the opposite reason. He only showed you what he wanted you to see and nothing more. I guess I'd have to say that I would have preferred to be Armstrong's friend, though I think it would have been great fun to hang out with Ellington on occasion. I'm not sure I would have wanted to work for him, though. And I'm well aware, as I said a moment ago, that a lot of the men who worked for Ellington over the years had sharply mixed feelings about him. Yet, they kept on playing for him, in some cases, for most of their adult lives. Because that's what you do when you find yourself working for a genius, a man who has the mysterious and inexplicable power to bring out the best in you. Mysterious, inexplicable. I've done my best to explain Duke Ellington's genius in my book, but I know that at bottom, all you can really do is bow to its irresistibly compelling power. A prime example of the mystery that is Ellington is his most famous composition, Mood Indigo, written in 1930. It's a 3 in the morning nocturne, and at first glance, there doesn't seem to be all that much to it. It opens with a 3-part chorale intoned by a muted trumpet, a muted trombone, and a clarinet playing down in the low register. The exact same composition, the exact same combination that Andre Previn had in mind when he said that Duke lifts his finger, 3 horns make a sound, and I don't know what it is. After that, you hear a pair of clarinet and trumpet solos, then a rippling little piano solo by Ellington himself, and then the band circles back to the beginning, and that's that. Like the poet said, that's all you know and all you need to know. Not all that much to it, just a handful of perfectly chosen notes, but they add up to a musical utterance that is as unforgettable as a proverb. It's an imperishable classic, one of a handful of songs that come to mind whenever Ellington's name is mentioned anywhere in the world. And that's why I wrote Duke, to try to bring you closer to the mystery of how such utterances were brought into this world. Yes, Duke Ellington was a seductively charismatic, impenetrably enigmatic character with a tabloid-friendly love life, but it is his music, not his personality, for which he continues to be known today. He was to jazz what Aaron Copland was to classical music, the great American composer. And his 3-minute masterpieces will be remembered for as long as jazz itself is remembered. And now the floor is yours. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have about Duke Ellington or about my book.
Terry, can I...
Thank you.
I do want to mention that our friends at Reading Reptile have got the book for sale, and you have to buy it before you leave. And I want to ask you...
And you can get it signed if you play your cards right.
And I want to ask you the first question, because you mentioned Billy Strayhorn, but just in passing, and in all the recent biographies of both of Ellington and of Strayhorn, and anything written about jazz in the last 20 or 30 years, the question of the relationship of Strayhorn and Ellington is very prominent, and there are very different views of that, and you're very interesting in the book. And before you answer the question, I just want to read this one passage, which is Ellington's eulogy that he had someone else read at Strayhorn's funeral, which is, I think, beautiful. William Thomas Strayhorn, the biggest human being who ever lived, a man with the greatest courage, the most majestic artistic stature, demanded freedom of expression and lived in what we consider the most important and moral of freedoms, freedom from hate, unconditionally, freedom from self-pity, even throughout all the pain and bad news, freedom from fear of possibly doing something that might help another more than it might himself, and freedom from the kind of pride that could make a man feel that he was better than his brother or neighbor, which is an extraordinary thing, an extraordinary piece of writing Duke Ellington did, also extraordinary considering their relationship, their very fraught relationship. Can you talk about it?
There's a whole chapter in Duke about Strayhorn and their relationship. There is nothing simple about it. Strayhorn was himself a genius, much younger than Ellington. It was essentially a father-son relationship. Strayhorn's own father had been abusive. Strayhorn got an introduction to Ellington. Ellington saw instantly that this young man from nowhere was a major talent, a talent in some ways comparable to his own. And he said, I want you to work for me. In fact, what he said was, I want you to come to my apartment in New York. And how you get there is you take the A train. It's a true story. And so Strayhorn got the directions, filed that piece of information away, and he wrote that song, which of course is Duke Ellington's theme song, written not by Ellington, but by Billy Strayhorn. The two men collaborated from 1939, when they began to work together, until just before Strayhorn's death in '67. But as I say, it was a difficult, complex collaboration, because when you have a father-son relationship between two people of comparable talent, there's not going to be anything easy about it. And Duke Ellington's, one of his great flaws was he was a credit hog. He really did like people to think on some level that he was the Wizard of Oz who made everything happen all by himself. And Strayhorn, at first he thought this was marvelous, and he had a reason for this. Billy Strayhorn was homosexual. And in the late 30s, the 40s, the 50s, a gay man who wanted to live an openly gay life, and that's what Strayhorn did, could not be a public figure. So it was kind of a bargain that they struck. Strayhorn didn't tour with the band. He didn't appear with the band. You go to YouTube, you'll find, I think, one piece of film that shows him playing with the Ellington band. He sends the pieces in from the road, and Ellington plays them. And sometimes he gives Strayhorn proper credit, and sometimes he doesn't. And at first, what was a wonderful miracle for Strayhorn became more and more problematic until in the 50s, they actually broke with each other for a couple of years. So as I say, it's a long story, and you know what to do if you want to find out more about it. But it's as important a story in Ellington's life as anything that ever happened to him. And it does say something about Ellington's own understanding of what a great artist he was, that he was willing to bring into his band and give this kind of access to the band to a musician who was directly comparable in talent to his own. Now, raise some hands and I'll come and talk to you. I'll get you first.
Gene Lee said that he thought Ellington's music would fade because so much of the work isn't sung today. And he attributed that to the racial politics of the era, which kept him from what he thought was the perfect lyricist for Ellington, and that was Johnny Mercer. What do you think of that notion?
Well, the question was, Gene Lees, who was himself an important lyricist and a jazz critic, thought that Ellington's music, his songs, might fade from view for a variety of reasons, racial politics, because he didn't work with the great Johnny Mercer, although, of course, they did write one song together, Satin Doll. The real answer to that is that we don't remember Ellington for the songs. Some of them we love, we sing them, they're important, they made him money. But the core of Ellington's achievement is not as a songwriter, it's as a composer of instrumental music. And in fact, Ellington was not himself a natural writer of melodies. This is something that's one of the most, if my book has any important contributions to it, one of them is that I seem to have been the first person to recognize that all of Ellington's pop songs, almost without exception, the melodies were written either in whole or in part by members of his band. They were collaborations, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not. Now, you don't have to be a great tunesmith to be a great composer. Beethoven was not a great tunesmith. Stravinsky was not a great tunesmith. But if you're going to write pop songs and get them on the top 40, you've got to be like Irving Berlin. You've got to be like Lennon and McCartney. Ellington wasn't. And so he created this complex collaborative process. And sometimes the guys on the other end of the collaboration ended up getting fobbed off for 25 bucks flat fee, which is what he paid Lawrence Brown for his part of Sophisticated Lady. No copyright, no credit on the label. So I know what Gene was talking about. Maybe you know, there's some point to it. But I think it's a little bit off to the side of the nature of Ellington's real achievement. His real achievement is as the great instrumental writer. That's what I would say. And I will come over to you now.
Can you say a bit about his relation with Mercer? Did he hope Mercer would succeed him, which he did?
It's a good question. I was just asked, can I say a bit about Ellington's relationship with his son, Mercer Ellington? I wonder what Ellington expected out of Mercer, because Mercer was no kind of genius. He was no Strayhorn. He was a pretty decent trumpet player. He played fourth trumpet in the band. Wasn't an interesting soloist. He wrote some compositions of real value, but we're not entirely sure how much of a hand Duke had in them. We're just not positive about that. And there is a well-attested rumor that Mercer's most successful piece, Things Ain't What They Used to Be, he actually won the rights to that tune from Johnny Hodges in a poker game. So Mercer ran the Ellington Ghost Band. If you're in the jazz business, you know what that means. It means a band, after you die, somebody else runs your band for you. Mercer ran the Ellington Ghost Band until his own death. And it was all right, but he was no Duke Ellington. And he had an immensely, maybe even a more fraught relationship than Strayhorn did with his father. He wrote a really good book about it called, what was it called? Duke Ellington in Person, I think. Published a few years after his father's death. It's one of the most valuable primary sources about Ellington, one of the most informative, and it is the work of a disappointed man, an angry man, who just didn't entirely understand why his father did what he did and behaved the way he did towards him. Not to put another commercial in, but all this is talked about in the book. But it's a tough story. You know, Mercer died long before I went to work on my book. I wonder, I would have liked to talk to him. I doubt if he would have told me or anybody else much of anything at that point. He's still, probably at the end of his life, he was still wrestling with the problem of what it's like to be the son of a genius. Yes, sir.
What do you know about Duke's relationship with Gordon Parks? I'm a friend of Gordon Parks, and I've read all of his books, and I know that Gordon Parks had traveled with Duke extensively.
Oh, you asked the right question. And when you purchase your copy of Duke, you will find in it some wonderful stories told by Gordon Parks. The question was, what do I know about Ellington's relationship with Gordon Parks, the great photographer? Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late in the process of writing the book. Parks also, this is one of the things that I found very late Parks gave the only first-hand description of somebody who was in the room when Ellington and Strayhorn were working on a piece together. And it's quoted verbatim in the book. And he also took a picture that I found the week after the production deadline closed for Duke. So I couldn't include it. It's on the web. It's a photograph of, it's a darkened TV studio. And Strayhorn is standing there in the shadow in front of a TV monitor right behind him. And on the monitor, looking stylish and forthright and heroic, is Ellington. It's as though he's looking down at Strayhorn in the shadows. That photograph, you talk about photographs that tell a story. Now, I couldn't get that one in the book, but it's not hard to find if you go on the web and look for it. But, you know, it was, Parks was fascinated by Ellington, like anybody else who ever met him. He wrote about him a couple of times, took a lot of wonderful pictures of him, and gave us some priceless glimpses, some of which I managed to shoehorn into the book. And you knew him. You're a lucky man. Other questions? This is your, I see you.
I have a sort of two-part question. Duke wrote his own book, Music is My Mistress.
Yes.
Right? I'm sure you've read it, and now you're telling us, you know, about how guarded he was.
Right. Some parts of it are true.
Yeah. My question is, how much of it was, you know, could we trust to be valid, and how much was, you know, hype?
The question is about Ellington's own autobiography, Music is My Mistress, which he wrote on cocktail napkins. You know, that's a famous story about Ellington, and I thought, yeah, right. And then I got into the archives and found the cocktail napkins. Cocktail napkins and manuscript paper. I mean, it was something that he wrote notes for Music is My Mistress over the last several years of his life, and Stanley Dance stitched them together into a coherent manuscript. It doesn't say anything bad about anybody, and it doesn't mention a single woman in Ellington's life. Not by name, not by allusion, neglects to mention that he was married. It is beyond doubt the most evasive memoir ever written by an important artist. But when somebody leaves a document like this behind, you take it seriously, even though maybe what it's telling you, the most important things that it's telling you, are the things that it's not telling you. So I grapple with this throughout Duke, trying to evaluate what we find out from Music is My Mistress. The best piece of caution I can give you about it is don't take anything in it at face value, but read it because it is fascinating.
My second, if you'll indulge me, I want to go back to one of your previous works, The Skeptic. And I know historical biographers kind of hate these kind of questions, but I just want to know what you think that Mencken would make of the Tea Party today.
I never answer questions like that. Seriously, when you ask a question like that, you're asking somebody to rip a historical event out of its context. I mean, the one thing you can always count on across the board with H.L. Mencken is that if politicians and politics had anything to do with it, contempt would be somewhere in his attitude. But I don't know, I can't speculate on that. Mencken's political attitudes reflect his own time, his own sensibility. Born in 1880, did most of his political writing in the 20s and 30s. And people do often ask me, you know, what do you think Mencken would think of X or person Y? And the answer is, I don't know, any more than I know what George Orwell would think of Obama or something like that. I mean, I could speculate, but it would be just as, it would be no more useful for me to speculate about the one question than the other. You know, all I know is that he had a nose for fraud. Sometimes he smelled it where it wasn't. But just as we should never take anything in Music is My Mistress at face value, Mencken never took any utterance by a politician or people connected with politics at face value. That's his rule, and I think it's a pretty good one, actually. Yes, sir?
One of my favorite jazz tunes is in a sentimental mood. Ellington with John Coltrane. I've heard rumors of the collaboration between them and the fact that it's older Ellington and Coltrane in his younger days. But I don't know much about that. But supposedly the rumor I hear is that Ellington was so frustrated with him, he just said, "You go," and he followed him.
You know, we don't have any reliable accounts of what happened at the session, and that's why I just mentioned it in passing in the book. I mean, it must have been interesting, Duke Ellington and John Coltrane in a studio together. But the truth is, we just don't know much about it. It's a beautiful album. That's a beautiful performance. Some kind of magic was going on. But we know a lot more about some other of those later all-star sessions. We know a whole lot, for example, about the recording that Ellington made with Charles Mingus and Max Roach, who started out not speaking, and it got worse after that. But an amazing album came out of it. Further proof that in jazz, you don't necessarily have to be on the best of terms to make magic. But unfortunately, I can't tell you anything that's interesting. I wish I could, other than that, yes, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous record. Anybody over here? A lot of silence from over here. Yes, sir. Yes, that's the album I was just talking about. Money Jungle is the name of that album.
Whose idea was that for them to come together?
Probably the record producer, as far as we know. It wouldn't have been Ellington's idea to do that. He was between. We're talking again about the album with Mingus and Roach, which is called Money Jungle, and it was recorded when he had just been dropped by his label, Columbia. So for a few years, he's a freelancer, and he's game. He'll try whatever's going. And Ellington, people sometimes ask me, how aware was Ellington of modern jazz, of different, newer kinds of music? The answer was he was extremely aware of it. And one of the ways that he was aware of music, you mentioned Gordon Parks earlier. Parks rode along with, Ellington used to drive, or rather be driven from gig to gig all over the country in Harry Carney's car. Carney was the baritone sax player. He joined the Ellington band when he was 18 and stayed on until 3 months after Ellington died, and then he died. But he ended up being Ellington's chauffeur. And Parks spent a day or two driving from, East Jesus to God knows where. And one of the things he noticed is that the radio was always going, because Ellington kept up with what was happening in the world of music on those long, long drives from gig to gig by listening to the radio, which back in 1955, 1960, 1965 is not like what it is now listening to the radio. You really could get a cross-section of all kinds of music, all kinds of things happening. He was very aware of the Beatles, recorded several Lennon-McCartney tunes. He was fascinated by Thelonious Monk and was sure, and he was right, that Monk was influenced by him. He had made one record with Max Roach before Money Jungle, and I don't like to speculate about what Duke Ellington was thinking, but I wouldn't be surprised if when he agreed to make Money Jungle, he was thinking, I'll show them a thing or two. I'm still hip. And he was. It's one of his best records. And one of their best records, too, even if they weren't speaking. Yes, ma'am. We're not set up to do that. I was planning on it, but it didn't work out. So fortunately, for those of you wise enough to buy a copy of Duke, there is an appendix at the end with 50 particularly significant recordings of Ellington chosen by me, all of which can be downloaded just like that from iTunes or anything like that. And they're what I recommend as your starting points if you know a little bit about Ellington. It's a historical cross-section of his music all the way down to shortly before his death. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that list. And I think if you were to listen to those 50 tracks, you would come away knowing what Duke Ellington was as a composer, the range of his achievement. And it's huge. It's enormously wide. You just get a sense of what he's about. So sometimes people put those best of lists together. It's sort of a fob off. It's a really serious part of my book. I took it very seriously. Yes, sir.
Curious about Mercer, the name, and I was just wondering if he was named for Johnny Mercer?
No, no, he was
Anybody have
born.
that in mind?
You know, it's every once in a while this happens. Somebody asks you something in a public place, you know the answer, and you go flat blank about it. I think there was a family connection to somebody named Mercer, but it wasn't Johnny Mercer. I mean, Ellington and Johnny Mercer knew each other, obviously. They wrote Satin Doll together, but they weren't intimates in any way. And this would have been long before, yeah, well, Mercer would have been born even before anybody knew who Johnny Mercer was. Any other questions?
Yeah, in your book, you talk about some of the musicians that tried out in the band and didn't make it, or the Mike Wickman, or I know that Charles Mingus was there for a short time, and some
2 weeks.
fight, yeah, a little legendary fight. But there were some other Mingus types that maybe were in the band for a while and didn't get along or didn't stay.
Well, he's asking about people who didn't make it in the Ellington band. I think the count, I mentioned it in the talk, we know by name about 900 musicians who passed through the band. Now, the band had a very stable personnel, especially in the early and middle years. People would come in because somebody was sick. People would come in and it wouldn't quite work out. The spectacular case was Charles Mingus, who one of the great jazz bass players and one of the most difficult human beings ever to walk the earth, who admired Ellington without reserve. It's a great dream of his. He's playing in the Ellington band, but he's Charles Mingus. So within 2 weeks, he gets into a fight on the bandstand with Juan Tizol. This was not a good idea because Mingus pulls a knife and Tizol pulls a bigger one. So there's a wonderful story in Mingus's autobiography, Beneath the Underdog. You know, he's the only source for it, but it sure sounds like Duke Ellington. Ellington explains, you know, I can put up with Juan. I've been putting up with Juan for years, but this is different. And you know, I never fire anybody, Charles, but you've gone too far, and so you're simply going to have to give me your resignation. And Mingus says he felt like it was an honor to resign. What interests me is, especially in the later years, there were some very gifted people who came through the band, played with it for a number of years, but Ellington didn't really take much advantage of them. There was this fabulous trumpet player named Johnny Coles. He's mostly remembered now for an album he did with Gil Evans. You know, you hear him, you think, Johnny Coles is in the band? Why didn't Duke write for him? Never wrote anything for him. I think, especially in Ellington's later years, his own creative energy is diminishing. He's somewhat more set in his ways. And I think maybe he just wasn't necessarily as receptive to some of the new voices coming through the band. But that is pure speculation, like the Tea Party. So I can only offer it as speculation, nothing more.
Was there any relationship between Count Basie and the Duke?
They were friends. Of course, they're both on the road all the time. So they made an album together, which is pretty cool, actually, although you can see that Duke has stacked the deck a bit, just a bit. But they each appreciated what the one could do that the other couldn't. You know, Duke knew that when it came to right down the center, in the pocket, swinging the blues, that there is no beating the Count Basie band. Basie, on the other hand, understands that he can't make this magic that Ellington can make. So there was some competition, I think mostly a mutual admiration society. That's how I would put it. And fair enough. That would be my attitude. Yes, sir.
I guess this is the time to ask the question. I was wondering on the way down there, I couldn't remember if it was Count Basie or Duke Ellington who did many of the moves.
Cab Calloway,
Cab Calloway,
who replaced Duke Ellington at the Cotton Club, as a matter of fact. And they were, in the book, Calloway talks about what it was like when he was unknown to meet the famous Duke Ellington. He said he'd never seen anybody so elegant and self-assured in his life. And he quite clearly saw Ellington not as a musical model, but as a personal model for the kind of charismatic figure that he wanted to be. Anybody in the back of the room? I really will come back and answer a question. But you gotta raise your hand. Or Henry, how's the clock running? Are we?
Okay, I do have one more question.
Okay.
For you, Jerry. You talked in the book about in the 30s and the 40s how Ellington and the band traveled in Pullman cars in the South, so they could stay in the Pullman car. They wouldn't have to go to they would have to go through the hotels that did or did not serve African Americans. And then in the 50s, in the years in the wilderness, they're on these buses that don't look like places you'd want to live in.
No.
And Louis Belson, and you want to talk a little bit about the Ellington and the South,
Sure.
in the 30s and the 50s.
Ellington in the South, but let me back up just a half step. You can't tell, the story of Duke Ellington is in part the story of black history in America. It's the story of race relations in America. It's the story of one of the very first black men to become very famous in this country and to be truly admired by white people at a time when this kind of admiration was, for many people, absolutely unthinkable. Ellington was well aware of this. He saw himself, and he was absolutely correct to see himself this way, as a symbol of black pride, of racial pride. And that was why he went to such great lengths to ensure that the band looked gorgeous, that he looked gorgeous, that every time he stepped out in public, he just glittered. And it also explains why, when he did start performing in the South, he went to tremendous trouble to make sure that nobody was humiliated. Now, obviously, there are no hotels for blacks in the Deep South. You know, that they'd be staying in boarding houses, or, forgive me, whorehouses sometimes. So what Ellington and Irving Mills did, they hired private railroad cars, Pullman cars. You could do that back then. Sleepers, Ellington had a roomette. You could cook on the car. The important thing, though, was they put you on a siding in the train station, and you're not treated like a black band coming through the southern town. And the folks would come up and say, well, now what's this about? What is this? And Ellington would say, this is the way the president travels. What an amazing, powerful statement of black pride that was right there. But after trains went out, you know, as the trains started, you couldn't get a private car during World War II. Nobody could. The band is ending up on fairly ratty buses. Ellington is driving from gig to gig with Harry Carney. And there's a photograph in my book that I pinned down. This is my favorite's not the right word because it's a terrible photograph, but it's a fascinating photograph. It's the band bus is parked in a parking lot of a motel in Florida. And they're playing softball. Duke is at bat. But if you look, you can see the sign of the motel. It's a neon sign, and at the bottom it just says, colored. That's another picture that paints 1,000 words, and this was in 1955. Okay. So, famous man who made a lot of money, the whole world knew him, but he was never insulated from the way things were. So anybody who tells you that, anybody who tells you that Ellington was too big, too famous to know what the life was like, you look at that picture and show it to them.
He also, he hires the first white musician to play in the band at that same time. He's in that picture.
Yeah, Louis Belson.
Who he has to pass off as not being white, as being Asian.
Yeah, I forget what did he call him? Latino, something like that. Well, I mean, Belson was a darkish Italian, something like that. So he's got to take him down south, so he's got to lie about it. He had Juan Tizol, who was a Cuban, was very light-skinned. Barney Bigard, who was a Creole from New Orleans, a clarinet player, very light-skinned. And so when Ellington made his first film in 1929, Check and Double Check, they made Tizol and Bigard black up for the cameras. Now, we chuckle at that now, I mean, because it's so many years ago. They were furious, absolutely furious. And if you go back to the clips, this was a major news story in black newspapers, this kind of embarrassment. By the way, The stars of that film were the two white men who played Amos and Andy. There's a piece of cultural history for you. And you know, yet another proof that Ellington's story is in so many ways America's story. And in writing this book, I tried to put Ellington in the big culture picture. You know, Ellington and Aaron Copland, Ellington and Stravinsky, that kind of thing. But also Ellington in the South, Ellington in America. What was his life like? What was his day like? That's really the fun part, the excitement of a biography, is that it's not just about one thing. And it's, in a way, it's not just about a man's life, too. It's about the context of the man's life. It's like a novel. I don't write novels, probably never will, though I said I wouldn't write a play until 3 years ago. But writing a biography, I think, must be very much like writing a novel. Ultimately, it's an act of storytelling, except that it's true. That's kind of, you know, your obligation. And Duke Ellington's story is an amazing story. It's just a fantastic story. I always tell people, if you can't write an interesting book about Duke Ellington, get another job. So I hope that you will find it so.
You've written a great book.
Thank you, Cosby.